Well, good afternoon, everybody from County Antrim. Thank you all so much for joining this PRONI presentation this afternoon. I'm very grateful to Stephen and Janet and their colleagues at PRONI for the opportunity to speak on the subject of researching Presbyterians in Ireland. And what I want to do in this, first of all, provide a very brief background to Presbyterianism and the different Presbyterian denominations on this island, then move on to looking at the range of records that are available for researching Presbyterians, and then look at where you can actually get access to these records. Finishing up with a few just general comments about researching Presbyterians in Ireland. So let me begin in a graveyard in County Antrim, Kilbride, and a wonderful mausoleum to the Stevenson family. It's been compared to a miniature version of the Taj Mahal that's been set down in the County Antrim countryside. The reason I put this up is not because of its fine architecture, exceptional though that is, but because it is the burial place of someone who could be regarded as a pioneer of Presbyterian historical writing in Ireland, congregational historical writing in Ireland. It was erected by Dr. Samuel Martin Stevenson, who was a Presbyterian minister and a doctor, and who in 1825 published a historical account of the congregation of Temple Patrick in County Antrim. In 1820, an order had gone out from the Synod of Ulster that ministers and congregations should spend a bit of time and effort in gathering historical information about their congregations, identifying records. And Stevenson was someone who took up that challenge. In his book, he did admit that it did prove more of an onerous task than he imagined, but he was determined to pursue it as possible. And Stevenson was someone who recognized the importance of getting access to original primary source material, something that all genealogists are well aware of, the importance of getting access to the records. In the case of Temple Patrick, Stevenson was able to make great use of the earliest surviving session book for Temple Patrick, which goes back to 1646. In fact, it's the earliest specifically Presbyterian congregational record in existence in Ireland. Now, in terms of the development of Presbyterianism, well, a few basic points. First of all, the earliest Presbyterians in Ireland can be identified in the Dublin area in the late 16th century. Some of them were English, including Walter Travers, who was the first provost of Trinity College, Dublin. However, it's really with the arrival of Scots into Ulster in particular in the early 17th century that we see the emergence of Presbyterianism, not initially as a distinct and separate denomination, but rather to begin with, Presbyterian ministers or ministers with Presbyterian convictions were accommodated within the established Church of Ireland. Now, in 1613, Edward Bryce arrived at Ballycarry in East Antrim to the Broad Island settlement, and he's regarded as the earliest Scottish Presbyterian minister to settle on this island. Now, the latitude that had been shown to Presbyterian ministers in the 1610s and 1620s was taken away in the 1630s when the government was anxious to enforce conformity across the Church of Ireland. That bringing the churches in the three kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland into much closer alignment. And as a result of that, ministers of Presbyterian convictions were required to either conform or basically they were excommunicated. And a number of them went back to Scotland. However, in 1642, an army arrived from Scotland in the wake of the 1641 uprising in Ireland. And in Carrickfergus, in 1642, the inaugural Irish Presbytery was formed by the chaplains accompanying the Scottish regiments. And the photograph on the slide now shows the Presbytery Memorial that was erected to mark the 350th anniversary of the formation of that presbytery. It stands now just outside Joymount Presbyterian Church in Carrickfergus. In the 1650s, we see the creation of further presbyteries, and the first meeting of what can be regarded as a synod, it's been referred to as a general presbytery meeting, but some have called it a synod, took place in Ballymena in 1659. Now, in the 1660s through to the 1680s, there were periods of persecution against Presbyterians by the state. However, with the Williamite settlement, we see the resumption of Synod of Ulster meetings, and from 1691, the records of the Synod of Ulster begin, the surviving records of the Synod of Ulster begin. However, as a result of the penal legislation that was primarily aimed against Catholics, but which obviously had an impact upon Presbyterians, Presbyterians did go through a period of difficulty in the 18th century. For example, with the extension of the Test Act to Ireland, Presbyterians could not hold public, or rather civil or military office. Basically, you had to provide evidence that you had taken communion in a Church of Ireland church. Presbyterian marriages were not regarded as valid, and so the children of those marriages were not viewed as legitimate. Presbyterians resented having to pay tithes to support the Church of Ireland clergy, as did all denominations. In 1719, a degree of toleration was offered to Presbyterians with the passing of the Toleration Act. Nonetheless, for many years, Presbyterians felt an estrangement from the civil and religious establishment in Ireland. Presbyterianism continued to grow, however. The early 19th century was a period of significant growth. And in 1840, there was a union of synods when the Synod of Ulster and the Secession Synod came together to form the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, which continues to be the principal body of Presbyterianism on this island. Now, I will mention the seceders in a moment. Now, of course, in addition to the General Assembly, the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, there are other historic Presbyterian denominations on this island. The non-subscribing Presbyterian Church owes its origins to a dispute within the Presbyterian Church in the early 18th century over subscription to the Westminster Confession of Faith. And those who did not believe that subscription was essential were known as the non-subscribers or the New Lights. In an effort to deal with those who dissented from this view, non-subscribers were placed in the Presbytery of Antrim. Now, that did not mean to say that all of them were based in County Antrim. Rather, the Presbytery of Antrim was created for the non-subscribers. Now, on the island of Ireland as a whole, there were other bodies of non-subscribing Presbyterians. The Synod of Munster was created in 1809. In the 1820s, there was another dispute within the main body of Presbyterians on this island, and that resulted in the withdrawal of a number of ministers and congregations and the formation of the Remonstrance Synod in 1830. In 1835, a number of the non-subscribing bodies came together to form the Irish Association of Irish Non-Subscribing Presbyterians. And in 1910, the Non-Subscribing Presbyterian Church was created. Now, the seceders, I've mentioned the Secession Church already. Well, that denomination owes its origins to a dispute within the Church of Scotland over issues to do with patronage. A number of ministers of the Church of Scotland, which is a Presbyterian church, a number of those ministers seceded, hence their name, and formed the Associate Presbytery. Now, as a result of missionary endeavours and connections and so on across the North Channel, seceder congregations were established in Ireland. The seceders in Scotland split into two camps, the burghers and anti-burghers, and although that dispute had no relevance in Ireland, nonetheless, seceders here also divided into burghers and anti-burghers. Now, as I've said, most of the seceder congregations joined with the main body of Presbyterians in this island to form the General Assembly in 1840. A number of seceder groups stayed outside that. You've got the Associate Presbytery, the Original Secession Synod, United Original Secession Synod, and so on. I don't propose to go into any detail on those because it is at times complex and frequently baffling. I do deal with these issues and these groups of Presbyterians in the introductory chapter to my book. And finally, then you have the Reformed Presbyterian Church, or the Covenanters, so called because of their attachment to the Scottish Covenants of 1638 and then the Solemn League and Covenant of 1643. They remained outside the religious establishment in Scotland. They were very much a smaller denomination of Presbyterians in Ireland. The first Covenanter minister was ordained in 1757, the first Irish Covenanter minister, that is. Presbytery was established in 1763 and a Reformed Presbyterian Synod in 1811. And there was a breakaway group for a time from about 1840 to the early part of the 20th century. Now, that's a very quick overview, of course, and I realize that there's a lot to take in there, but it's important to emphasize that there are various different bodies of Presbyterianism on this island, various shades of Presbyterianism. They are not one single homogeneous grouping. The Presbyterians in Ireland have been writing their history from the 17th century. On the screen now, you can see a page from the Adair manuscript, written by the Reverend Patrick Adair, who was minister for a time in Cairncastle in County Antrim before moving to Belfast. And Adair was commissioned by the Presbyterian Church to prepare a history of the rise of Presbyterian government in Ireland. It was published, a version of, or an edition of it was published in the 19th century. And a few years ago, the Ulster Historical Foundation published a new edition by a number of academics led by Dr. Robert Armstrong of Trinity College, Dublin. It provides a very interesting insight into the development of Presbyterianism on this island. It's something that in some ways gives us an understanding of the emergence of this denomination in the 17th century and how Presbyterians saw themselves. So Presbyterians have been writing their own history for centuries, and a number of books that you can certainly read that can provide you with more information about Presbyterians in Ireland. James Seaton Reid was a Presbyterian minister based for a time in Carrickfergus in the early 19th century. He produced an exceptionally detailed history of the Presbyterian Church. If Stevenson can be regarded as a pioneer of congregational history, Seaton Reid was really a pioneer of the academic study of Presbyterianism in Ireland. His first volumes were published in the 1830s, but then continued by W.D. Killen and published a complete set published in the second edition in 1867. It's a book you can get access to through the Internet Archive, through archive.org. More recently, Finlay Holmes, a very distinguished Presbyterian historian, wrote two studies of Presbyterianism, two very accessible studies of Presbyterianism. 1985, Our Irish Presbyterian Heritage, and in 2000, The Presbyterian Church in Ireland, A Popular History. And then, more recently still, Lawrence Kirkpatrick has produced a very handsome publication on Presbyterians in Ireland, An Illustrated History. It's the image on the slide now. It includes an overview of the Presbyterian story in Ireland and also includes a paragraph on each of the Presbyterian congregations on this island, along with a photograph. That is the Presbyterian congregations of PCI of the General Assembly. Looking at works on congregations themselves. Well, indispensable is a history of congregations in the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, published by the Presbyterian Historical Society in 1982. And that provides short histories of each of the 500 plus Presbyterian congregations in Ireland. It's very useful in determining when a congregation first came into existence, the circumstances at which it came into existence, and then the succession of ministers of that congregation. So, for example, you're looking for an ancestor who was born in 1800, but the nearest Presbyterian congregation to where they lived was not founded until 1830. Well, there, obviously, you need to look elsewhere for records relating to that family. So, the history of congregations, it has been digitized and is accessible for members of the Presbyterian Historical Society. I'll be talking about the Presbyterian Historical Society in due course, but if you're a member of the Presbyterian Historical Society, you can get access to the digitized version of a history of congregations. Now, congregational histories themselves are invaluable. If I could sing, I would sing a song of praise for congregational histories and those who write. Perhaps now there are upwards of, well, who knows, maybe 300 congregational histories now in existence. They are absolutely indispensable. If you're looking for an ancestor and you know the congregation to which they belonged, then I would definitely emphasize the importance of seeking out that congregational history. They can contain information that isn't readily available elsewhere. They bring the benefit of local knowledge about local families. It's very important that you find out if there is a congregational history and then seek that volume out. There are good sets of congregational histories in the best set is in the Presbyterian Historical Society. There are also good collections in the Ulster Historical Foundation, the Linen Hall Library, and other library institutions on this island. Andrew Holmes, the historian, has noted that there is a seemingly unique obsession of Ulster Presbyterians with writing and reading congregational histories, and that is undoubtedly true. Just to give you an example, a history of Ballyalbany Presbyterian Church in County Monaghan, published in 1940, includes an absolute wealth of information of the people associated with that congregation. So we see, for instance, subscribers to a call to the Reverend Thomas Clark in 1751, subscribers to a fund for rebuilding the meeting house, seat holders in the church, 1804, stipend payers, 1866, subscribers to the Manse Fund, 1873, and uniquely, signatories to a memorial opposing the wearing of a gown by the minister about 1873. You'll need to seek out the book to find out what that was all about. Moving on to the range of congregational records, and here maybe noted that Presbyterianism, by its very nature, creates records. The various layers of church government, from the local session, the body within the congregation, to the presbytery, to the synod or general synod, or general assembly, an absolute wealth of written records have been created and are very useful to you in researching your Presbyterian ancestors. You're not just dependent on baptisms and marriages, and maybe burials and death. Unfortunately, there are not very many Presbyterian burial registers or death registers, but there's so much else. And I'd again emphasize the point of finding out what else is available for the congregation, aside from simply baptisms and marriages. And some of the things you may find that are available, that are accessible to researchers, include the minutes of meetings, minutes, say, of the session or committee, meetings, lists of communicants, visiting books. Those are books kept by the minister as he visited the families in his congregation. You might find a congregational census, transfer certificates, calls to ministers, financial records, accounts, etc. records relating to seating arrangements, title deeds, or congregational associations, whether they have a recreational focus or a temperance focus or a focus on the missionary work of the Presbyterian Church. I'm going to show you some examples of these records now. So first of all then, baptisms. And formative baptisms varies quite considerably, even from within congregations and of course over time. This for Tober Key in North Antrim from the 1830s. The congregation itself was founded about 1830. And you'll note, say the underlined entry. So twin children of Alexander Curry of Corvallis. So you get the name of the child, you get the date of baptism, the name of the child or children, the name of the father, and the townland. So in this instance, it doesn't give you the name of the mother, but other Presbyterian baptismal registers will include the mother and may even give you the mother's maiden name. You might also find that they include not only the date of baptism, but also the date of birth. The other underlined entry concerns James, a grandson. Okay, we don't know the precise reasons for that, but here we have a grandfather who is bringing his grandson in for baptism. I'd also make the point that even though from 1864 you can get access to official birth records in Ireland, I would still encourage you to check out the availability of baptism records because you may find information recorded in a baptismal register that you won't find recorded on an official birth certificate. So you may have the birth certificate from 1864 onwards, but still don't overlook the fact that you just may find extra information of interest in the baptismal register. You'll also, of course, get marriage registers. This is an early one from the period 1712 to 16 for Card Money, Presbyterian Church in County Antrim. Again, the information in these marriage registers can vary. In their simplest, you will find the date of the marriage, the two parties getting married, and the name of the officiating minister. Later on, you may find the names of parents. And of course, from 1845 onwards, you will have the names, or you will have official civil registered marriages conducted in Presbyterian churches, or conducted under the auspices of Presbyterian ministers. It's interesting that certainly prior to 1845, the marriages of Presbyterians tended to take place in family homes, or maybe the home of the minister, or maybe even a public house. Not many people actually were married inside the Presbyterian meeting house. Likewise with baptisms. Many baptisms did not take place in the Presbyterian meeting house itself. Many times Presbyterian baptisms took place in the family home. Now, at different times there were attempts to curb private baptisms. There were people raising concerns about the baptizing of children in private, and it should be a public ceremony. But the fact is that many Presbyterian baptisms did not take place in the church, certainly prior to the early 19th century, and in some cases after that. I mentioned the fact that not many Presbyterian congregations have burial or death registers, certainly not prior to the late 19th or even 20th centuries. Part of the reason for that, it's not the only reason, but part of the reason for that is that many Presbyterian churches do not have an adjoining burial ground. In my home parish of Donaghady, there were 5 Presbyterian churches, and not one of them has an adjoining burial ground. In this case, we have a page from the funeral register of the first Presbyterian church in Belfast from the early 18th century. It's not so much a funeral register or burial register, as rather a record of the hiring out of funeral gear. So the type of things you would need for a funeral, such as a mark cloth, well, you came to the church and you hired those out, you paid a fee, and in recording the hiring out of this gear, the clerk or the minister noted down who was hiring out the items and the name of the deceased, the person for whose funeral these items were required. So that survives for the period 1712 to 1736. And it's clear that it's not simply of relevance for those researching Presbyterians in Belfast, that you could say the catchment area, the hinterland, is extended much further than simply Belfast. Now, session minutes can be very useful if you're looking for Presbyterian ancestors. The session was the body within the congregation, the ruling body. It was composed of the minister and the ruling elders. And in many ways, the session sat as a court, and it regulated the affairs of the congregation. It disciplined errant members. It dealt with the admission of new members. And in many cases, the session intervened in issues which today we would consider more the realm of the civil courts rather than the church. We see on the screen a page from the minutes of the Antrim meeting of Covenanters. This congregation included Killswater and Cullibackie, and it dates from the late 18th century, and it considers a range of different issues. You can see them listed on the screen. Some of these are specific to Covenanters because of their attitude towards the state, such as voting and the franchise. Other matters dealt with would have been issues that faced sessions in other Presbyterian denominations, such as for example, the distribution of money to the poor, disputes between members over various matters. So session books can contain some very useful information. One issue with them, of course, is that rarely will they be indexed. It is a matter of plowing your way through them, and you never know, you may find information of interest to your interest regarding your own ancestors. You can find accounts. These are First Armagh accounts from the early 18th century. These are not the originals, rather these are transcripts that are now available in PRONI. But you can see the way in which the session allocated funds for various purposes. The second entry is for thatching the meeting house and a payment to Alex Greenfield, presumably the thatcher. But further down, you see for burying Ephraim Donaldson, for burying William Trotter, further down to Mary McCartney, an orphan. Above that, Philip Lynn, a disabled soldier. So information on those in need who required assistance, families where they were simply too poor to bury a family member, and so needed assistance from the congregation to do that. So people who may escape many other records, the sort of people who aren't going to leave a will, the sort of people who maybe probably don't have a headstone, who maybe weren't leasing land in their own right, but you may find them in the accounts, the surviving accounts of a Presbyterian congregation. Now, communicants books are also very helpful to you in your research into your Presbyterian ancestors. This is a communicants roll book for the congregation of Cullibackie in County Antrim. It provides the name of the communicant, the society with which they were associated. At this time, Reformed Presbyterian congregations were organized by what was known as the society. So families living within a geographical area are part of a society, and then the societies together form the congregation. This particular book includes the occupation of the communicant, details about when they were admitted, and then the column on the far right side provides remarks or observations. And if you go down that, you'll see references to people who emigrated to America or who died. You can see gone to America, gone to America, gone to America. References to when somebody died, gone to General Assembly, and so on. So these books were kept updated. They had to take account of changes if somebody had left the congregation or had passed away. So again, these can be very, very useful information, useful records in searching for your Presbyterian forebears. Another one, Congregational Census, you could say, a listing of the members and adherents of the Reformed Presbyterian Church in Fountain Street in Londonderry. And we have the listing of the names of the members. And again, we have observations. So we have details about when a particular individual died or somebody removed to Glasgow and the date. Again, somebody died. Further down, we have a record to somebody who died of scarlatina, something that, was just written down. It was an observation. It was felt important. Somebody else who emigrated to Melbourne in Australia. So records like this are well worth checking out. These are the sorts of things that you should be looking out for to see if these records exist. So certainly baptisms and marriages are essential building blocks in looking for your Presbyterian ancestors. But the Presbyterian Church, there's so much more. Within some congregations, you will have records of those who were admitted to the congregation or who left the congregation. And someone who is leaving a Presbyterian congregation would come before the session and seek a certificate or a testimonial, sometimes called the Certificate of Disjunction, which basically testified to their good character, their good standing within the congregation. They then took this document with them wherever they were going, and when they wanted to join a new church, they would present it as evidence of their credibility, of their good standing within their previous congregation. So among some congregational records, you can actually find detailed listings of the individuals who were issued with these certificates. So here we have for our Dunbow Presbyterian Church, in North County Londonderry. So on one side, certificates received, certificates given. And so we see individuals who are emigrating to America, further down, going to Scotland, going to America. Look how many are listed there. It's nearly one every week. Here is the transcript of an actual certificate of disjunction in PRONI. And I'll not read it in full. You can see it on the screen. But issued to Mrs. Jane Johnson, otherwise McConnell. It refers to her membership of the church in Antrim. It refers to her good conduct, her respectability. She's going to America to join her husband there, and she was going with the best wishes of the church. So this is the sort of thing that would be issued to somebody. They would carry it with them, and they would present it to the new church they wish to join, wherever that was, whether it was in America or Canada or in Scotland or Australia, New Zealand, wherever it might be. Now, many of these certificates of disjunction survive within families. Others are found within congregational records. Sometimes, within families, they may be tucked into the family Bible, for example. Now, title deeds are something else to look out for. If a congregation was wishing to build a new church on a new site, it obviously required a deed from the landlord in order to do that. Sometimes these deeds can contain extensive lists of names of the principal members of the congregation. On the screen is one from 1836 for Bushmills in North Antrim. And it's from the MacNaughton family, the landowning family in that area, to the trustees or the representatives of the congregation. In this case, there are only 2 names, but in some others I've seen there could be upwards of 20 names of individuals who were parties to the deed, to the title deed of the congregation. Moving on to the higher courts of the church. These too can contain invaluable information. The problem with them, again, is that they're not going to be indexed in most cases. So it is a matter of working your way through them. And you can't, of course, be certain that you will find information of relevance. But here's one from the Strabane Presbytery Records from October 1730. And these records are very detailed. Here we have record: John Caldwell and Grizzle Johnson appeared as appointed, and both confessed they were married by, in the terminology of the time, a popish priest, a Catholic priest, but were not willing to live together. The presbytery, having heard them, exhorted them to be reconciled and live together in love and with the fear of God. So there isn't going to be a record of that marriage. And yet here we have, through the Presbytery Records, an indication that a marriage was conducted and was recognized by the Presbyterian Church, and an exhortation for the couple to live together in harmony. So Presbytery Records, again, they're not going to be the first thing you go to, but in the absence of other records, and if they survive from far enough back, they are worth checking out. The earliest surviving Presbytery records for a presbytery in Ireland are those for the Antrim meeting, which survive from the 1650s and which have actually been published in book form. And they have obviously been indexed because they've been published in book form. Moving up to the Supreme Court within the Presbyterian Church prior to 1840, the Synod of Ulster. These, the minutes of the Synod of Ulster from 1691 to 1820 were published in 3 volumes. You can get access to those now through the Internet Archive, archive.org. While much of the business of Synod was fairly routine, various issues, of course, were dealt with. Occasionally, you can find real gems in terms of names and invaluable genealogical information. So here's one from 1738, and it concerns the congregation of Dromall, or Randalstown in County Antrim. And basically, a section of that congregation wished to separate and to join the neighbouring congregation of a Huckle. And very usefully, written into the minutes of the Synod of Ulster is a listing of the names of the heads of household of those who wish to detach from Dromall and join with Huckle, and a separate listing of young people. Now, young people could be young adults who had come into membership, but who had not actually joined the congregation in their own right, but a very useful listing of names. Now, again, it only represents a fraction of the membership of that congregation. Nonetheless, there are no other congregational records for either Dromall or a Huckle prior to the 19th century. And yet here we have the names of at least some of the members of the congregation in 1738. Calls to ministers can also be very helpful in providing names, especially in the absence of other records. Okay, you go to look for a congregation and, well, there are no baptisms and marriages before 1820, but there is a call to the minister from 1770. So that can provide a very helpful substitute in the absence of, say, the registers. This is one from the 20th century. I just put it up. It relates to the Reverend J.W. Calderwood, and it's a call from Brady. Basically, whenever the members of a Presbyterian congregation wish to, or rather had identified someone they wanted to be their minister, they issued what was known as a call to that person. And the call set out the reasons why they wanted the person to be their minister, and then it was signed by the members of the congregation. So though I know that's a fairly recent one, but some of these calls, well, I've seen one going back to the late 17th century and others from the 18th century. So again, very useful information. And then moving on to looking at records of ministers. Well, If you want to find out more information about an ancestor who was in the ministry, the Presbyterian ministry, then check out the Fasti of the Presbyterian Church. The Fasti published in different series, but each one providing a brief biographical sketch of the minister. The name of the minister, where they were born, when they were born, where they were educated, where they were licensed to preach, where they were ordained minister, maybe some details about their own family, who they married, when they died, perhaps even information on their children. So the Fasti of the Presbyterian Church for the General Assembly, 1840 to 1910, published in 3 booklets. Prior to 1840, a separate series of Fasti of the Presbyterian Church. And you get copies of these in the likes of the Presbyterian Historical Society. I know there are copies in PRONI also and in the Ulster Historical Foundation. So these are available in different institutions, and you can check them to find out more about your Presbyterian, if you have an ancestor who was a Presbyterian minister. Now, sometimes ministers kept diaries, and those diaries survive. Again, they can contain invaluable information. The Reverend Robert Miguel of Antrim was really quite astonishing for the level of detail that he recorded about the members of his congregation, the Antrim congregation. And in his diary, he kept detailed records of those he visited, of the people he baptized, of where he drank tea and enjoyed refreshments while he visited members of his congregation. If you have an ancestor who belonged to Antrim Presbyterian Church in the early 19th century, there is a superabundance of relevant material. I'll not read out the detail on the slide, but you can just see how many names actually appear in that one diary entry from 1827. Now then, where do you get access to these records? Well, briefly, first place to start for records in Ulster is the Guide to Church Records produced by PRONI, and which can be downloaded from the PRONI website. Lists are, the arrangement is by civil parish, but it lists the name of the churches, the records that are available, and the PRONI reference, or if it's available in another archive. So if we look, say, Achaderg Parish, County Down, we'll note that for the Congregation of Glasgow, there are baptisms, 1780, 1844, and so on. They are in PRONI, MIC, that's on microfilm in PRONI. Session minutes, 1760 to 1818, are held in the Presbyterian Historical Society. PRONI has also digitized some of its collections of Presbyterian records, and these are available in PRONI, not on the PRONI website, but in PRONI you can get access to some of their digital church records. So under Achadui, you can see minutes of session meetings, 1702, 65, 61 actually, digital records, that's the reference, but on particular computer terminals in PRONI, you can get access to that session book, and there is a page from that session book. In this case, it's a listing of money dispersed to the poor. The Presbyterian Historical Society is a very important archive, of course, for Presbyterianism. Its librarian is the hugely experienced Valerie Adams, who brings a wealth of knowledge to her role as librarian, and who has steered the society into the digital age. So you can get access to quite a bit of information on the Presbyterian Historical Society website. Some of it is available only to members of the society. Other information is available to anybody. But the Presbyterian Historical Society has produced listings of Presbyterian records that are available, whether in PRONI or in the Presbyterian Historical Society. And those listings are fuller than the PRONI Guide to Church Records for records in the Presbyterian Historical Society. those lists are available to members of the PHS. Other archives in Ireland have got collections of Presbyterian records. Just to mention a couple of collections, the Louth County Archive Service has got very detailed records for Dundalk and Carlingford, for Castlebellingham and Jonesborough and Omeath congregations. They're within the Louth County Archive Service. While the Dublin Unitarian Church collection is in the Royal Irish Academy, and it is a very large collection of records relating to a number of different congregations in Dublin, now represented by the one Dublin Unitarian Church. And more broadly, for records of Dublin congregations, check out Stephen Smurl's book, A Dictionary of Dublin Descent, where he lists the records available for congregations in Dublin and where they can be found. Finally, a couple of points. First of all, keep an open mind on your Presbyterian ancestors. Do not assume that they always belong to one particular congregation. Do not assume that they were always Presbyterians. Here is a slide showing you 3 churches. In the first church, Brady Reformed Presbyterian Church, my father was baptized. In the second church, Mahra Mason, my grandfather was baptized. And in the third, Donalong Church of Ireland, my great-grandfather was baptized. And this wasn't because the family moved around. This is all while the family was living on the same farm. So 3 different churches, 3 different denominations, and 3 generations. So keep an open mind on the church to which your ancestors belonged. Search all the available records. They may have been attached to one church at a time, but that doesn't mean to say that they were always members of that church. So keep an open mind on your ancestors. Never rule anything in or out until you're absolutely certain, and expect the unexpected. And you never know what you might find until you start looking. And I'd like to thank again PRONI for the opportunity to give this talk today to mark the publication of my book, Researching Presbyterian Ancestors in Ireland. And the website where you can purchase that book is on the screen. So again, thank you all very much for joining in. Wherever you might be in the world, it's been a privilege of mine to speak to you this afternoon.